Hi, this is Dr. Doreen Downing. I'm hosting the Mindset Social author series where we get to interview people in our platform network who have authored books about mindfulness. And today I get to interview and be with and have a conversation with one of my friends, Calvin Niles. Hi, Calvin.
Hello, good to see you and thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. I know you in the very early stages of this network and this platform that you hosted podcast series. So your voice may be familiar to some folks here.
Yeah, no, it's great to be back after a very busy couple of years, but yeah, it's great to be back in the mix and reconnect with you and some of the others in the community.
Good. I'm going to read a bio just so that people know some details before we get going on our conversation about your book. Calvin Niles is a coach and consultant known as the Mindful Storyteller, making a positive impact on the lives of leaders, entrepreneurs, coaches, and wider society through his services and products. Through his experience in mindfulness, storytelling, coaching, and business, he empowers others to be authentic in their life and work. And Calvin has worked with hundreds of people, from leaders in large corporations and from solopreneurs to some of the top 10 charities in the UK. And that's where, if people can listen to his accents, that's where he's based. So, Calvin, the reason why I'm doing this author series is because I found you on the platform and you've done a book called Mindful Storytelling. And I
Mm,
know it's more geared towards corporations and helping corporations tell their stories or executives tell their stories so they can reach clients. But I would imagine that what I've read in your book applies to any of us who have any kind of business going on about telling our stories and doing it in truth, not just to impress somebody or make a point. I mean, point, of
yeah.
course, is the point, but like it rings or resonates from us. So first, tell me what is the origin story of that book, of this particular book? How did you come to write it? What was behind it in the first place?
Good opening question.
Yeah.
Um, some years ago, I had this book around storytelling kind of gestating, let's say. And I think back in 2016, I had a business coach, Denise, who was like, "Hey, Calvin, you ought to write a storytelling book." And I said, I'm really not ready to write this storytelling book. I was running a startup at the time. I had just left, transitioned out of a corporate job. And I said, actually, if I wanted to write a book, I'd write a novel. So first I actually wrote a novel. But then that was good because it gave me some space to,
Mhm.
mm, I guess, polish my tool set as I kind of started to work more with different sectors, different leaders. And I realized that there was a kind of maturation that was happening, and there was a good opportunity. I started to work also in the technology company within the last 3 years and reaching out to leaders all over the world in this global organization. And I saw, people, there's an appetite, let's just say, for authentic storytelling, away from, as you talk about, and you do this very much yourself, is moving away from the performative storytelling
Yeah.
and more to what wants to be expressed. But how do we link that
Uh-huh.
to something strategic, right? Because
Oh, yeah.
in business, there's always some outcome that we're seeking.
Uh-huh.
And so there is, so the tone of the book is all about understanding that we can bridge our authentic story with framing it in a strategic way. But hey, and we're mindfulness people, and we know we're not the stories that we tell.
Yeah.
And so, how can I get this intersecting message
Uh-huh.
at this time for people who really want to grow in their careers? And that's the kind of journey to putting pen to paper with this book. And it's a short, easy to read book. The chapters are really punchy. And it's playful. It's
Uh-huh.
playful. And so that's the genesis.
Well, that's an invitation too, by telling us briefly, what it's about and how it came to be, and then topping it off with, "Hey, folks, it's going to be fun." And what I get around the journey that you're talking about, not only that first book, which I did read a while ago, which was a personal, I thought, it was maybe fiction, but it's really nonfiction, right? Wasn't
Oh,
it?
The Sun Rises in Eastmore, the
Yeah,
first book.
yeah.
It's totally fiction, but it is definitely, it's a lie that tells the truth.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Well, just this journey that you have had as an author to face the blank page, but now not only just feeling like you have, like you said, more skill, but then saying, well, how is it relevant to the places I happen to find myself, which is in corporations, which is in business? And you're right about this bottom line. But I would say that even for those of who are out there listening now, if you have a private practice like I do, it's still important that, there is a goal. Well, I mean, you could say there's a goal to get people to work with me, but there's also a goal once they work with me, I do make money. So I guess there's kind of a bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also something you actually want to say, you know? And so
Oh,
so I do actually have a big emphasis in getting your messaging right. So
mhm.
really early on, it's kind of understanding for me, okay, well, why do you want to tell a story? So
Uh-huh.
in the book, we understand we're not the stories that we tell. And mindful storytelling is really about bringing that consciousness to the stories that we're holding and telling. So you're the storyteller, but you're not the story. And so it gives a lot more freedom to move around the story and
Uh-huh.
to pull different messages from different experiences and perspectives that might be applicable to for various scenarios. So in there's scenarios around just meeting with a team member and you just want to have a one-on-one. You have an audience of one. What kind of story do you tell?
Uh-huh.
Or maybe you're on the stage and you have a very large audience. Maybe you're just trying to motivate your team. But even actually, and in there, I mentioned, let's start with your first audience member, and that's yourself, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, you started out, that was fascinating that you say you're not your story. That
Yeah.
that was like bomb. Because when I think about telling my story, it feels very, very personal. So I love that there's I don't know, you'll tell me more about the process, but if I'm mindful, I'm aware of this thing called an experience or a story, as we call it, but it's actually a life experience, most likely, if it's something that I want to tell that happened, that has relevance.
Yeah. I would say for me, I have an experience which is very different from a story. The story is the meaning I give to the experience.
Uh-huh.
It's my narrative for me of
Uh-huh.
how I interpret that experience.
Yes.
And so often people interpret the same experience in many different ways. Does that mean the experience itself has changed? Or just does it mean the narrative around it has changed? And so for me, just having a little bit more freedom to be playful with the stories gives us space to go, okay, this is not therapeutic here. At this in this book, it's not about me venting my spleen, right? This book is to say, I am in a corporate leadership position. I want to grow my career. I want to transform my career, but I'm also actually quite a mindful person. And
Yes.
I'm also developing my own practice in another way. Maybe I'm really just curious about what is this thing called mindfulness or consciousness. And the book doesn't go into any depth directly about that part of it, but is really just the container to say, be aware that you're not your story. And that gives so much more freedom from the outset. Um,
Mm-hmm.
then when we bring that to ourselves, what's the story I'm telling myself? And it's very narrowly targeted to this audience, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm not the best storyteller. And I talk about the usual suspects, my story's not good enough. Who wants to hear my story anyway? I don't know what my story is. So we have a lot of common narratives that we run in our heads. So it's to say, hey, decouple from that.
Mm-hmm.
The stories are available to you, woven out of your experience, and you can tell them if you have a message you want to convey. And here's how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Start with your message, understand why you're telling it, know who you're telling it to, and then here's some tools that you can use. So that's how I kind of um, structured the book, and then gave people the opportunity to pause and say, okay, mm, now I'm finding this tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, why? What do I do next? And I call
Mm-hmm.
that part dealing with gremlins.
Oh, that was the list you started to make just a second ago. It's not worth it, or will people really listen? Will I be able to? I mean, is it really a story? Am I a storyteller? No, it's not about being a storyteller. Oh, how fascinating already. I just feel like you're painting a picture that compels people to say, oh, I want to read it. Really, I feel like that's what you're doing by saying it's easy. You just do this first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth. And what do you know? You've figured out how to be in any situation, whether it's just walking with a friend somewhere or at the, like you say,
Exactly.
the cooler or in front of the board or on a stage or in a small group meeting. And the mindfulness, and that was the other point you just made, I think, was around it's the narrative is what the story is. And I think that's where the mindfulness is like, oh, I mean, because really, even my own experience could be narrated in different sort of ways depending on who, okay, the audience is, right? Or who's the listener.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. And
Uh-huh.
there's something really interesting here because I think what you're doing is you're showing actually quite skillfully that there's a nuance for a lot of people. When they hear story, they also think narrative. But actually, people say, okay, well, there's the story. The story is what happened. The narrative is the way you tell the events of what happened.
Hmm.
Um, But of course, we know as mindfulness people that stories change, memories
Yes.
are interpreted differently. In fact, the way we remember events actually
Mhm.
change very significantly over time. You might have
Yeah.
told when you were 20, you might have told of the story very differently. You would
Uh-huh.
have narrated those events in a very different way. But what I really try to do in this book is make it super practical.
Hmm.
And that's something I really wanted to do that was different from a lot of the other storytelling books that I've encountered. And the other storytelling works, of which there are many, and I would encourage people to explore this whole world of story. But
Hmm.
one thing I really wanted to do that was different was to, first of all, I mentioned already freeing oneself from the limitation of the belief that the story is who you are. I try to get people to identify much more with the awareness of the story. So there is a part of us that is aware that a story is there. And I try to say, hey, you're the projector, you're not the movie, you know?
Hmm.
And so if you're the consciousness that lights up those stories, it gives a lot more space to now explore that story freely. But where the rubber hits the road is that you have a message you want to give to the audience. And then we get very strategic. Then we start to move and say, okay, now we know this. How's this going to help someone else? How is my experience and all the things that I've been through in my life and my work going to help someone else? Because invariably, not only are we interconnected, but we're actually quite naturally as humans service oriented. We don't realize it. It's
Uh-huh.
more natural to want to help others, you know? And so the stories actually then becomes the vehicle for a message, which may be helpful for someone. It may be helpful for your customer. It may be helpful for your team to build their morale. It may be helpful to inspire people to action.
Mhm.
I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and he was talking about his team and how he led his team over the last 17 years, various teams of different sizes through so much change.
Uh-huh.
And he said, one thing that I've always tried to do, even though a lot of my team members, of people who have led over the last 17 years have moved on, they have different managers, they still see me as a leader. Why? They come to me for advice. And I think that's because when you inspire people, you get them to build an appetite to reach the horizon, but you don't need to show them how to build a boat.
Yeah.
And so I think when we start to think, does our story actually have some usefulness? And we realize that actually it does. How do we want to frame that? Who do we want to
Mhm.
give it to? And how might it be helpful for someone else? So that was the kind of really practical way of grounding,
Mhm.
moving through the phases of I know I'm not my story. Here's a little bit of history of storytelling in this context. Here's how it
Mhm.
actually works.
Mhm.
But hey, don't get too hung up on that. Let's
Mhm.
just get really practical. You want to
Mhm.
tell a story? Start with a message. Figure out why you want to tell it. Do you want to connect? Do you want to inspire? Do you want to teach? Do you just want to express yourself? You know?
Mhm.
And so once we get clear on that, we start to realize actually this is more strategic than I thought about it before,
Mhm.
than I thought it was before, rather.
Mhm.
So that's where I try to be a little bit different with this book and make it succinct as possible.
Mhm. Well, you're making it very succinct by the way you're talking about it today. The projection, though, that just really took me back. That the light of the story, how the story can radiate is by the sense of us being the projector. So that was a new thought that I'll be taking with me today. And then this intentionality is what I heard also, that there's a purpose. Isn't
Yeah.
just, well, I mean, I guess if the purpose is just, hey, look at me, but it's not. That isn't the kind of storytelling you're talking about for businesses and getting to something that, well, like you say, perhaps the bottom line. So you're talking about practicality. I get the kind of strategicness of it. Before we get off, what can you say that would be like a practical? I mean, and in some ways, you've already given me what to do practically. Anything else that somewhere down the line that you can say, um, this is a practical tip?
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. So typically it's why, know why you're telling the story. That's one
Why?
really, really practical tip. So
Okay.
soon as we get really clear on the reason for the storytelling,
Ah,
that's helpful.
uh-huh,
And this is not to say, because nothing is ever black and white, this is not to say that sometimes stories just emerge, right?
uh-huh,
Sometimes things just emerge, things just surface in the moment. You may be in a meeting with a person you're working with, and a story may just emerge. So it's okay to follow that. But
hmm
often we're doing something that we prepare for. So from that perspective, if we're preparing to tell a story and we know that we're going to do this in this meeting, in this engagement, this team leadership, or even upward management to execs and so on, I'd say know why you want to tell the story and know what your key message is. And then finally, always have something that you're going to ask people to do at the end. And the asks doesn't need to be explicit.
Yeah. The ask could be think about
It,
it or,
Yeah, could completely
reflect.
yeah, totally implicit. Yeah. Have a think
Yeah.
about that anyway, or just to let you know.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that I would say that's probably something I would encourage people to take away. Other than that, we're natural storytellers, you know. That's what we
Uh-huh.
do. We live and breathe story naturally
hmm
because of our language evolution, because of how we conceive the world and um, how we think about our relationships. We're natural storytellers. So I'm less worried about people's storytelling abilities, and I'm more interested in helping people, at least in this book, because I do have another one coming out. But at least for this book, it's very tightly framed um,
Uh-huh.
on that playful strategic purpose. of delivering a
Uh-huh.
message with a story.
Yeah, I like the message that you just gave about the why. I know that when I'm preparing to, I usually start with some kind of moment, meaning, message, a story that has something about me. There's some meaning in it that can be taken, and then what's my message for the people? And I usually start my talks that way. But sometimes I reflect because I'm right now thinking about, well, how do you do the search for what would be like? Do you start with who it is? Do you start with, well, what intuitively starts to come up? And I notice that with me, sometimes, I'll sit and I know who the people I'm going to be, and I wait for a story, or I have a bank of stories, and then I go, which one would be good for? So those are the two ways in terms of
Very nice.
I don't know, you don't want to call it digging for stories, but before we go, let us know any kind of hints about how to search or identify,
Mm.
tag story.
I really love your approach and how you described it. I would agree exactly with you. And those are the two most common ways. I think, people are different. And given the scenario, if the more mindful one becomes, the
Hmm.
more intuitive
Yes.
people are. And
Yeah.
so actually they're then there is a trust that, hey, the right
Uh-huh.
story will actually arise.
Ah,
And that's where I think where you talked about in one approach is to
yeah.
be like, hey, let me just sense into the moment. There's something I want to share here, and the story emerges. So that is very open way of doing it. And
Uh,
somehow you still find to link it back to the message that you want to give, right? So it's still conveying something. But then
uh,
other people find that quite difficult. Maybe they're a bit stressed out, maybe the memory isn't as well oiled as it would normally be because of circumstances. And it could be anything. It could be anxiety. It could be they just didn't sleep well last night. Could be they're a bit lethargic because they just had a huge dish of pasta. I don't know. But
uh-huh.
but then you can have rely on your story bank then, as you
Uh-huh.
suggest, right? And that would require some pre-work where you start to go, okay, well, where can I look for stories? So there's the spark approach I talk about in the book where you think about situations and
Yeah.
you kind of go back and you kind of think, well, what was it I really want to say here? Then you
Uh-huh.
create this library, or you could
Yes.
you could do the journey approach where journey of unforgettable reflections and experiences of yesteryear, I call it, or yesterday.
Uh,
And you can just go back to your life and
uh-huh.
appraise your life and say, okay, what were the big things? What were the milestones? And
Hmm.
I think those are more appropriate for people who want to tell signature stories, really meaningful stories about how they came to where they came to. But sometimes people just need a good anecdote,
Uh-huh.
in a meeting.
Yes.
Sometimes that's all people need. So
Oh.
it varies, and I would say those approaches you just mentioned are both very good and very useful.
Uh-huh. Well, practically, I've had a recent experience myself where I was invited to speak to a class, a group of women who are searching for their partners, that are looking for love, you might say. And how do you use your voice and how do you open your heart and all of the letting people in as well as expressing yourself. And I have to tell you, Calvin, the story about me being diagnosed as a diabetic is the one that kept coming.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't get away from it. It was
Wow.
just like, "Ugh, don't know what the heck this has to do with love."
But it kept coming up, right?
Well, what you said is intuitive, and I think that's what I just finally said, okay, let me just sit with it. Diabetes is about opening up your cells to receive the glucose, which is sweetness.
I love that. That's brilliant. This is a case in point, the more mindful we become, the more conscious
Yeah,
we become about stories, about what's present, about what's alive, those observation muscles that we can strengthen in our practice
yeah,
enhances that capacity to allow things to arise and to also trust it as well. Because
Try.
can you imagine that, something might have arisen and you go, what the hell is that? Why am I talking about that? No, I'm not telling that story.
You're
I'm
right.
going to shut that down.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
you trusted that. So it's a great example,
Yeah.
case in point. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, I keep saying before we leave because I just don't want us to leave. But it is time to say goodbye. And I would love it if you just reached into this now moment and shared whatever comes up for you to close our time together.
Hmm.
Thank you. Taking that breath.
Just thank you for reaching out. I trust that whoever is listening to this will take something away that resonates. And my encouragement is to just trust that.
hmm Wonderful. Well, and who's ever listening or watching the replay, check out Mindset Social, which is on the internet where we have mindful professionals, which are meeting together, meditating together, and increasing our sense of awareness and presence so that our authenticity begins to radiate out into the world and touches more people with life force. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.